Before we get to Judges 9, I want to invite all of you to raise both your hands up in the air as high as you can. I want you to grab an imaginary bar and lower it like you're lowering your expectations right now. Because my friends, I am rusty. I have been preaching alone in a room for 60 weeks, and I am overwhelmed with sensory experiences right now. So if you leave today, or if this is your first time here, I hope it gets better after this. So if he seemed a little jumpy. Yes, I am a little jumpy today. We're gonna do the best we can, but this is just exciting to be here, so thank you for joining us. The book of Judges, chapter 9, requires you to understand what happens in Judges 6 to 8, the 3 chapters leading up to it. Now, Judges 6 to 8 is one of the most famous stories in all of Scripture. It is the story of Gideon. Now, Gideon is often held up as an exemplar of the faith because Gideon had tens of thousands of soldiers that he was going to march against 150,000 Midianite soldiers. And God looked at Gideon's army and said, too big, too much. I want you to pare it down a little bit. Eventually, God pares Gideon's army down to just 300 people, and Gideon leads 300 soldiers against 150,000 Midianite soldiers and ends up defeating them in battle. Now, the logical application of this story of Gideon should, of course, be that we need a smaller military. Christians, however, take a very different attitude toward this story. The primary lesson they gather is that in war, there is always a righteous side and there is always a wicked side, which isn't quite the logical conclusion one would assume from the story of Gideon, but that's what most people take away. I want to invite you to discard this understanding as we go into the next story because it's introduced at the very end of Gideon's story when we read that Gideon had a lot of wives and concubines. We read in verse 30 and 31 of chapter 8, now Gideon had 70 sons. It's a lot. He also probably had 70 daughters, but they don't get mentioned in this part of the story. His own offspring, for he had many wives. His concubine who was in Shechem also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. Now Abimelech is the main character of the story of Judges 9, and his story was captured in artistic form by an artist named Cavissimo who lives in Los Angeles. So he depicts the scene of Abimelech's birth as seen here. So whenever you see a picture in this style, just know that the artist's name is Cavissimo, and Cavissimo takes these different parts of the story and illustrates them. So we read in Judges chapter 9, verse 1, these words, now Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal. Now, I don't know why, but Jerubbaal is another name for Gideon. He has 2 names. Who knows why? Went to Shechem. Now, Shechem is an important place. This is where the story unfolds. Shechem is where Abimelech's mother is from. So in my life, Shechem is the equivalent of Minnesota, don't you know? To his mother's kinsfolk, and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family. So he goes to Shechem. Now, Shechem, you may know where Jerusalem is. That's the blue star. Nazareth, where Jesus is from, is the green star. Halfway between them is the city of Shechem, just so you have some context to understand where this story unfolds. So Abimelech sends messengers to Shechem, his mother's family people, and says, hey, say in the hearing of the lords of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Gideon rule over you, or that one rule over you? He then drops a subtle hint when he says, remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. So he says, do you want 70 kings or do you want one king? And just remember, I'm one of you. So when Abimelech says this, he's dropping a very strong hint that he should be eligible to be the first king of Shechem and by extension, Israel. We hear about the reaction from the people of Shechem when they say, so his mother's kinsfolk spoke all these words on his behalf in the hearing of all the lords of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. He's one of us. He will fight for us. Let's back this guy in this political arena. We then read that the people of Shechem gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the temple of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. So Shechem funds his political and military campaign. Abimelech then went to his father's house at Ophrah, and he killed his brothers, the sons of Gideon, 70 men on one stone. So Abimelech takes the money, hires mercenaries, and then goes back to Ophrah. He gets there and he kills all of his brothers, except for one. Now, this seems like a violent, chaotic, primitive, barbaric story. I want you to know it's a chaotic, primitive, barbaric story. This is captured by Cavissimo in this scene where he kills all of his brothers. We read that he kills all of them except for one, which is a man named Jotham. The youngest son of Gideon survived, for he hid himself. Now, with 70 brothers dead and only one brother on the loose that's in hiding, all of the lords of Shechem come together and they crown Abimelech as the first king of Israel. This is way before Saul's time, and when people say that Saul is the first king of Israel, they're kind of technically mistaken, because Abimelech technically is the first king of Israel. So they went and crowned Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. And when it was told to Jotham, the one surviving brother, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them, "Listen to me, you lords of Shechem, so that God may listen to you." And Jotham, the youngest brother, begins to tell a parable about power. And this parable is very compelling to me. In this parable, he says there was a great land filled with many trees. And the trees one day looked around at each other like trees do, and they said to each other, "We should have a tree that can rule over us as king." So the trees were very excited to establish this new tree political system, and the trees began saying excitedly, "Which one of us should be king?" And eventually the trees decide that the olive tree should be king. And so they go to the olive tree like trees do, and they said, "Olive tree, will you be our king? We want a ruler." And the olive tree responds to the other trees, "Shall I stop producing my rich oil by which gods and mortals are honored and go to sway over the other trees?" And the olive tree essentially says, "I'm kind of busy making olives. I don't think I have time to rule over all you tree folk." So they get rejected, and immediately the other trees say, "Well, who else can we get? Why don't we get the fig tree?" So they go to the fig tree and they say, "Fig tree, why don't you be our king?" And the fig tree thinks about it for a moment, and the fig tree says, "Shall I stop producing my sweetness and my delicious fruit and go to sway over the other trees? No, I will not." And the fig tree denies the tree kingship because he's busy making figs. So then they say, "Let's go to the vine from which we get grapes, the grapes that produce wine and grape juice." And they say, "Vine, will you be our king?" And the vine says, "Shall I stop producing my wine that cheers gods and mortals and go to sway over the other trees?" So the vine is busy producing grapes. So the trees look around, having been rejected 3 times, and they say, "All 3 trees have told us they're too busy to be our king. Is there a tree or a plant that doesn't do anything?" "Ah, I know," says one of the trees. They say, "Why don't we go to the bramble? The bramble does nothing except poke people. Let's go ask the bramble to be our king." So the trees shuffle over to the bramble and they say, "Bramble, will you be our king?" And the bramble is honored. The bramble says, if in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade." Now at this point, people hearing this parable would have laughed, because does the bramble offer any kind of shade? No. "So come rest in my shade, which I will give you none." It then goes on to say, "But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon, because if a fire starts in the brush, it can burn down a giant tree." And with that, the parable of Jotham comes to a close. And when you look at the implications of this parable, he's talking about politics, and he is saying only the people who don't produce anything worthwhile will end up in politics. And therefore, the worst rises to the top. This was written 3,500 years ago, my friends, and it feels like it might have been written yesterday. So Jotham then tells this parable and says, "You think Abimelech's a good ruler? He is the bramble in this story. He wasn't doing anything with his life. He's thorny, and he will devour us if we're not careful." And then Jotham, the younger brother, curses Abimelech's name and curses the city of Shechem. After this parable and that curse, we read, "Then Jotham ran away and fled, going to Beer," interesting name for a city, "where he remained for fear of his brother Abimelech. And Abimelech then reigned over the kingdom of Israel for 3 years. We then read, though, that it was not a peaceful reign. we read that God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the lords of Shechem, and the lords of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. And we read that over those 3 years that he reigned on the throne, there were constant skirmishes, constant ambushes, constant guerrilla warfare that tried to undermine the throne of Abimelech. This came to a head when a man named Gaal came along, and Gaal started looking around saying like, I think Abimelech's a bad king. We'd be better off without a king. But he's a reasonable person, so he keeps those thoughts to himself, which is a bit of a problem because he goes to parties where he likes to drink. And at one of the parties, he starts drinking, and the truth starts to come out. He has a little bit too much, and he starts telling the people at the party, which Abimelech is not at, he starts telling the people at the party, he's like, who is Abimelech? And who are we of Shechem that we should serve him? If only the people were under my command, then I would remove Abimelech. Now, we don't know if Gaal remembers any of this conversation, but there was a lot of consequences from saying these words. Because these words get back to Abimelech, who is the king, may I remind you, and he doesn't like it. A few days later, Abimelech rallies his troops. They go around the city of Shechem, which is Abimelech's family, may I remind you. They surround the city, and as soon as the sun rises, they declare war on the city of Shechem. Abimelech now is killing his own people. It really kicks into full-blown genocide on the very next day when we read about how Abimelech surrounded the city, and anyone who came out of the gates or attempted to go into the gates ended up being slaughtered by the army of Abimelech. Once the gates were secured and nobody else was coming in or going out, Abimelech then sent 2 companies out into the fields where people were working to slaughter all of the farmers. After this massive amount of genocide, and it seemed like there was no one left to kill, Abimelech then took salt. He picked it up and he spread it over the ground of Shechem. This is a strange thing for us today, but back in Abimelech's day, this was known as a curse to spread salt on the land, to wish that it would never become fertile once again. Now, there were about 1,000 people who were able to escape from the city of Shechem. They ran up a hill as fast as they could, a hill nearby where there was a tower at the top. They then locked themselves in the tower, hoping that Abimelech would not follow them. But Abimelech saw them and followed them. He got up to this strong tower and saw the people cowering safely inside, hoping that Abimelech would not break the tower down. But Abimelech had a different idea. He started cutting into the brush and the bramble around this tower, and he commanded all of his other soldiers to do the same. Once they had cut the brush and the bramble into kindling, they set it around the tower and lit it on fire. We read here, and they set the stronghold on fire over them so that all the people of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. I tell you this because when we talk about Abimelech, we have to talk about the fact that Abimelech is a tyrant. He is such a tyrant that after he completely wipes out the city of Shechem, the city that houses so many of his own mother's family, he realizes that he wants more destruction. He then turns to the city of Thebes. He captures it. He overtakes it. And once again, there are a bunch of nobles who are able to escape, and they try to run up to a hill to a large tower. They arrive at the tower, and once again, they lock themselves in the city of Thebes. We then read in the Bible, but there was a strong tower within the city, and all the men and women and all the lords of the city fled to it and shut themselves in, and they went to the roof of the tower. Now, if this sounds familiar, this is exactly what happened in the last episode where 1,000 people just died. Abimelech sees them cowering in the tower, and he says, I know what I need to do. He then goes to the tower and fought against it and came near the entrance of the tower to burn it with fire. He begins to line the base of the tower with kindling to light it on fire once again. And we assume that these people are about to die in a mass genocide from a tyrant. But this story is different because we read the words, but a certain woman. Now, when we talk about a certain woman, we talk about a certain woman. And I asked Crystal Chavez, who is part of this community, to draw this certain woman, and this is the drawing that she came up with. Now we read, a certain woman threw an upper millstone. Now an upper millstone is about 25 to 35 pounds that rests on the top of the mill, and its responsibility is to crush the grain that goes through the mill. It's 25 to 35 pounds, 2 inches thick. She picks it up and she heaves it over the wall of the fortress and the tower. It lands on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Now, just when you think this story can't get any wilder, we read that about how immediately Abimelech called to the young man who carried his armor and said to him, "Please draw your sword and kill me so people will not say about me, a woman killed him. Please, this would be the worst. I'd rather die right now than have any chance of survival." So the young man thrust him through, and he died. If anyone ever tells you the Bible's boring, just have them read the interesting parts, okay? We then read, when the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they all went home. Then God, these are the last 2 verses of the chapter, then God repaid Abimelech for the crime he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the wickedness of the people of Shechem fall back on their heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, son of Gideon. The end of the story. What a wild story that one is. Now, if you're like me, you read this story and you all of a sudden start to feel some tension. You feel some tension because this woman right here seems like a hero. Now, she doesn't have a name. All we get is a certain woman. But she's the one who throws the rock that completely shifts the tide of the story. And while it's easy to celebrate that this woman is a hero, we have to ask, what is she heroic for? And when we start to say, well, she's heroic because she killed Abimelech, it's all of a sudden saying like, oh, should we glorify people who commit acts of violence? Is it possible to view this woman as a hero and also to avoid glorifying violence? I believe the answer is yes. And when I say yes, I think it's possible for us to look up to this person as a hero of the faith and of humanity, and at the same time to step around and avoid and acknowledge the violence, but at the same time not glorify the violence in this story. To explain that, I want to tell you the story of my niece, June Hadley. Now, June is the blonde. My other niece, Heather, is the brown-haired, curly-haired girl right there. June is 6 years old, and a few weeks ago, we got to go to Mammoth Mountain to ski together with the cousins. It was fantastic. We not only had cousins join us, but we also met up with a couple of friends, and here's a picture of my daughter, Maya, with her friend Sarah Peterson, and June Hadley skiing on the lift together. Now, it was a great time skiing with these 3 ladies. They were just having a great time. They're at the point where they're independent and can go wherever they want on the mountain. We're skiing blues. We even skied a few black diamonds. It was a fantastic time. Now, we have 2 ages in our kids groups, and what happens is my brother and I were watching the older kids this time when this story unfolds. And so we had 4 kids with us. We had June, Sarah, Maya, and my nephew Levi. When we started watching these 4 kids, remember, 4 kids versus 2 adults, we started skiing down the mountain, and these kids were just perfectly obedient. They would follow in a perfect line, as you see here. That's my daughter Maya in front. She's the most cautious skier, so we strategically placed her right up front. And they would just ski down. Everyone behaved. Everything was great. We were having an awesome time together. Scott and I were like, this parenting thing is easy. Everything's under control, right? But as we started taking more runs, speed started to increase. And this nice and neat line ended up breaking apart. And the person who was consistently in the front was not the oldest, my nephew Levi, but my niece, June. To give you an idea of how fast June was going, here's a video that I took of Maya. And you can see June is all the way up there, so she's way ahead of everybody else. Now, by the time we get to the top of this mountain, Maya and I, look how much further the gap is between June and Maya than it is up here. Here's Maya at the top, there's June at the bottom. That's a long way down there, and it means that she hauled all the way down the ski slope to get to that point. Now, after this run happened, Scott looked at me and he said to me, June's out of control. She doesn't have brakes, she doesn't have turns, she can't slow down. We've got to do something. So Scott turns to the kids on the lift and says, okay, kids, new rule. You have to stay behind Uncle Craig. And I'll be, Scott, who's June's father, I'll be in the back, Uncle Craig will be in the front, everybody's got to stay in between us, and Craig's going to have you turn and slow down and do brakes and all these other things, and it'll be great. So we go down the run the next time, and June is right on my tail. She's following the rules, she's watching every step, every turn that we make, and she's right behind me. For the first 25% of the run, she's doing everything she's supposed to. The next 25% of the run, she says to me, Uncle Craig, go faster, come on. But she stays behind me until we get to halfway down the run. And I look back at her, and she says, Uncle Craig, can you please go faster? I said, nope, we're working on turns. And when I said that to her, I could see the wheels turning in her eyes, through masks and goggles and everything. And she started doing some calculations of risk and reward. And she all said in her eyes, screw it. She turned down as fast as she could and beelined to the bottom of the mountain. Now all of a sudden I'm having to play catch up with her. My brother's mad at me because I didn't keep June behind me. And I'm like, it's not my fault. She is flying down there. I see her skis going like this. And I'm like, we are going straight to the emergency room after this. It's going to happen. We get to the bottom. Somehow she stops. And I'm right behind her. Uncle Scott, her dad, is right behind her. We get there, and I'm like, June, what are you doing? You're supposed to stay behind me. And Uncle Scott, or Scott the dad, says to his daughter, he's like, June, what did we talk about at the top of the mountain? And June said, I was supposed to stay behind Uncle Craig. And Scott said, and what did you do, June? And I kid you not, I promise I'm not exaggerating. She lifted both hands in the air like this. And she said, as she shouted, I broke the law. Zero remorse in her voice. Zero sense that maybe she shouldn't be so proud that she had blatant disregard for the rules. Now, Scott, who was ready to be full parent mode, just doubled over laughing, and he looked at me, he's like, I have no idea what to do from here. Just go, June, just go. We got back to the cabin. This became a bit of a thing. We took pictures with her breaking the law, all this stuff. Now, I thought about this story a lot because this is one of the highlights of the year for me. And there's only one word that can describe this story for me, and that word is endearing. This story is endearing to me, and whenever we can assign words to describe the bigger stories behind the stories, all of a sudden, those words start to have some real meaning, and we can ask questions. What makes this story so endearing? Well, I think to answer that question, we have to ask another question. Is this a story about abject defiance? Or is this a story about love? Because that's a big difference in how this story is perceived. I mean, from Scott and my perspective, this is a story of defiance. We set up a law for the safety of the kids disregarded the law, and we had to have some consequences. But from June's story, there's an entirely different perspective about what this story means. I mean, think about it. We're on this lift, and we're like, hey, everyone, we need everyone to slow down. That's the law. Now, I know June, and there are times she is defiant. That's fine. Lots of kids are defiant, right? But in this case, I don't think she was sitting there hearing the laws and thinking like, what stupid law? I want to be the one who makes the laws. That would be defiance. And I don't think that's what drove her to go skiing past me. Instead, I picture her hearing us saying, hey kids, it's time to slow down, that's the law. I picture her responding, but I like skiing fast. I like going fast. Why would you ski if you have to ski slow? And so when I hear this story, and when I tell this story, and when I got to live this story isn't a story about defiance for me. This is a story about a little girl who loves to ski fast. And if she becomes a downhill racer one day, you can bet we're going to tell this story over and over again because it talks about what she loves to do more than her defying the rules. So let's return to our story in Judges. Remember, we're asking the question, can we view this woman as a hero without glorifying the violence? And I told you the answer is yes. I believe that we can. Now, If you were with us last week, you know that we talked about Judges, and we talked about the story of Jael, and we talked about how Judges is very poetic, crafty, and well-written in the way that it exposes how violence is cyclical and pointless. Last week, we talked about how violence, according to Judges, violence, weapons, and murder will never deliver justice and peace. And when you consider that this story of this woman with the millstone is part of that larger collection of stories, it starts to cause that tension to tighten even a little bit more because it seems to be saying the opposite of what we just experienced. So when we look at this story, let's approach it the same way we approach the story of June. When we use the word endearing to describe June's story, let's use the word heroic to describe this one. What makes this woman so heroic? And then from there, we can ask a second question. Is her story about violence, or is her story about love? And to answer that question, I want to refer to Dr. Wilda Gaffney, who lives in Texas and teaches at Texas Christian University. She wrote a book in 2017 called Womanist Midrash. In this book, she gives very practical advice for everyone in the best ways to read the Bible in the tradition of womanist theology. A very practical question she gives the reader is that when we're reading scripture together, we can ask the question, where are the women and girls in this story? What are the women doing? And what are their names? This ultimately changes a lot of the ways that we read the Bible. And I will tell you that I have found this to be immensely helpful when I study the Bible. When I hear stories, ask, what's happening to women in this story? Because it's there that you usually find the most compelling and heroic stories. So when we talk about Judges 9, let's see how women are handled in this story, because there are 5 different mentions of women in this chapter. The first mention is from Jotham, the younger brother who told the parable of the trees and who is the youngest brother who survived. He does not like Abimelech for very good reasons, right? He, though, discounts Abimelech because his mother was a concubine, unlike Jotham's mother, who was a legit wife of Gideon. He says these words, "You made Abimelech," he's talking to Shechem, "the son of Gideon's slave woman, king over the lords of Shechem." The second mention of women in this story is when we get to that first tower outside of Shechem, the one that Abimelech lit on fire. We read that over 1,000 men and women died in that fiery blaze of that tower. The third mention of women happens right before the woman's millstone story, and that is when we hear about women running for their lives to a strong tower in the city. They all think they are about to die. So if we were to ask, what are women doing in this story so far after 3 different mentions? I think it's fair to say that in Judges 9, women exist only as collateral damage in war. They don't get to decide who lives and who dies. Men get to decide who lives and who dies in this story, and they are simply there to say whether or not someone was cruel or merciful after their victory. Which brings us to the fourth mention of women in this story. We read, "But a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull." And the fifth and final mention of women comes from a dying Abimelech who is desperate to make sure that his legacy is not that he was killed by a woman. When we hear those words, it's almost like he's saying with his dying breath, looking up at this woman who has just defeated him, saying, "She broke the law. A woman's place in war is on the sidelines. She's not supposed to do that. What's she thinking? That's cheating." And all of a sudden, we look at this story in a very new light, don't we? Because let's say that it was a man who dropped the millstone on Abimelech. Will we use the same words to describe the man in this story? Will we call this man heroic? We might, but considering the context that women were facing and this woman's action, I would say she's much more heroic than a man who did the exact same thing. Allow me to explain this. When we talk about this idea in Judges that violence, weapons, and murder will never deliver justice and peace, what we have to understand about the book of Judges is that Judges talks about the ethics of violence. And whenever we talk about the ethics of violence, we must always talk about power dynamics. This is really important because Abimelech is the one who has all the weapons. Abimelech is the one who just killed 1,000 people. And for us to say, Abimelech killed 1,000, but this woman killed one, so we got to make sure that we don't hold her up as a hero, is to ignore the massive amount of death that this woman was facing just a moment ago. Whenever we talk about ethics of violence or nonviolence, we must always talk about power dynamics. This is why it is so painful when a white American quotes Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachings about nonviolence without acknowledging the power dynamics that are happening in this country right now. It actually serves as another form of oppression when white people do this. Because yes, Martin Luther King Jr. frequently talked about nonviolence, but he did it in a way where he acknowledged the power dynamics that were in play. And white folks come along and quote that out of context, and it is another form of oppression. So here we have a tyrant who is killing all these people, and this woman who's doing something that feels heroic but still feels violent in its nature. And we feel this tension from both sides. Is she actually heroic? Is she actually violent? What is it that we're supposed to do? Why doesn't the Bible just tell us, this woman is a hero? Wouldn't that be nice? And it would be nice if the Bible spelled things out as evenly as possible, but I've found that the Bible rarely, if ever, does that, and when it does, it actually ends up being more damaging than the author intended. You see, the Bible is really fascinating because we have this idea that it's like an instruction manual for our lives, that it will tell us what is right in every situation. But the Bible is at its best when it leads us into deeper wisdom, when it invites us into the moral ambiguity and dares us to question what is right and what is wrong, to grow in our spirituality and try and understand what might be right and what might be wrong in our daily lives today. And so when we look at this story about a tyrant and a woman, and the fact that this tyrant only views women as being something that he can decide whether they live or die, views women as just collateral damage to end up killing or not kill, it's almost like we look at this woman holding this millstone up, ready to throw it, and she says to herself, I refuse to be this man's collateral damage. I refuse to be a sideline character in the story. I refuse to let this man allow me to live or allow me to die. We ask the question, is this a story about violence or is this a story about love? And when we look at that and what this woman is doing, I am overwhelmed by the fact that this woman was filled with love in one of the things that just doesn't feel like a loving action. This certain woman, she had enough love for herself and for her people to refuse to accept her role as collateral damage. We all live in a society and in a world where we are told that there are things that make us lesser than the people around us. We are told that if we are the wrong gender, that we are not worthy of being paid as much. We are told that if we identify as queer, that it really breaks our parents' hearts. We are told that if we look like this and talk like this, then we can advance very quickly. But if we step out of line, then maybe you won't experience fulfillment or promotion or good things happening to you or even blessings. And in those moments where if you get the sense that people are trying to silence you because of who you are, I would say that this story speaks to us and dares us to believe that sometimes the most courageous thing that we can do is to have great love for ourselves. Sometimes the best thing that we can do is to say, you know what? I am made in the image of God too. Sometimes the best thing that we can do is when people say like, hey, you're not like the other ones. You're supposed to stay over there. You say, no. And while some may interpret it as an act of defiance, I believe it's ultimately an act of love. My friends, may you see and embrace the image of Christ in all, even in yourself. Amen.